Hey ladies and gentlemen, this is Miss Hubbard here, and we're going to go over another note. She's just going over the quadratic formula so we can make sure we get some more practice in with that. So let's go ahead and let's just remind ourselves of what the quadratic formula is. So get that written on the top of your note sheets. The more time you write it, the more likely you are to remember it, and that way you also have it as a reference point whenever you're going through your homework. So let's take a look at some different versions of the quadratic formula. So what happens if there aren't three terms? If there's not three terms, then you're missing the B or the C. So those B's or C's are going to be 0. Okay? So let's go ahead and let's start taking a look at number 1. So for number 1, I notice that there's no thing that's just a number. So my A is 2, my B is -7, but my C is actually going to be 0. Okay, there is no C value. So that really doesn't change how we calculate it out. We're just going to use C as 0. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at that. Oops, we don't need a radical quite yet. So we're going to do x is equal to the opposite of b. Well, since it's a negative b, we're going to write positive, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all of that over 2 times a. Should be a 0 there. Okay, so again, remember when you're calculating out the quadratic formula, you really want to make sure that you simplify that in there. Okay, so then you're going to get 7 plus or minus the square root. So then in your calculator, you're going to take -7 squared minus 4 times 2 times 0. And when you do that, you end up getting 49 divided by 2 times 2, which is 4. So now we're ready to make our plus and our minus versions for number 1 here. So let's make our plus version. So we have 7 plus the square root of 49. So first you're going to type that into your calculator. 7 plus the square root of 49, then hit enter. And then you're going to take your answer and you're going to divide it by 4. And when you do that, you end up getting 3.5. Then you're going to take 7 minus your square root, and then once you type that in, hit enter, get your answer, then divide it by 4. And when you do that, you get 0. So the answers to number 1 are 3.5 and 0. Alright, so let's go ahead and get rid of this. Let's take a look at number 2 now. So for number 2, we're going to assign our A, our B, and our C. So our A with the squared term is just going to be 1 because there's no coefficient there. There's no x term, so the x term is going to be 0. So B is 0. And we have a constant, so our C is going to be a -36. And now we're ready to plug this into the quadratic formula. So we get that x is equal to the opposite of b. Well, opposite of 0 doesn't really make sense, right? It's still going to be 0. Plus or minus the square root of 0 squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so there's our setup. So now we want to simplify just what's underneath our radical, and this should have been a 1. Okay, so we want to simplify just that part. And when you simplify, you plug that exactly into your calculator like I have it written there, you end up with 144. So you get -0 plus or minus the square root of 144 over 2. Well, -0 doesn't really mean anything, so I'm actually going to get rid of that altogether. So all I have are plus or minus the square root of 144 divided by 12. So I'm going to do my positive version first. I'm going to do 144, the square root of 144, and then I'm going to hit enter to see what the square root of 144 is, and then divide that by 2. And I get 6 as one of my answers. Then I'm going to take the negative version. So I'm going to take the negative square root of 144. Then I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to divide by 2. And when you do that, you get -6. So positive 6 and -6 are our two answers for number 2. Okay, so what happens then if the equation that we're doing isn't set at equals to 0? Well, that means we need to bring whatever's on that side and get it over to the other side so that it does equal 0. So let's take a look at it number 3, for example. Well, I see that 5's over there on that side. Well, conveniently, if I subtract 5 from both sides, I will get 0 on that side. So then I get x squared plus 3x minus 5 is equal to 0. Okay, so now we can go ahead and plug this into the quadratic formula. Well, our a is going to be 1, our b is going to be 3, and our c is going to be a negative 5. So now I'm ready to plug this in. So we're going to do x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all of that over 2 times a. So again, I want you to simplify underneath the quadratic formula first. So simplify that guy first. So then you get negative 3 plus or minus the square root. Well, 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 5. When you type all of that into your calculator, you end up with 29. And then 2 times 1 is going to give you 2. So now I'm ready to create my two different versions. So let's start with the positive version. So I'm going to do negative 3 plus the square root of 29. And then I'm going to type that in. I'm going to hit enter. And then I'm going to take that answer and divide it by 2. When I do that, I end up with 1.192. Well, I want to round to 2 decimal points. I see that this number is less than 5, so I'm going to keep the second number the same. So my first answer is 1.19. Now I want to do that with this negative version. So negative 3 minus the square root of 29. Hit enter in your calculator. Then do divided by 2. And when you do that, you get negative 4.192. So again, that third number is less than 5, so I'm going to keep it the same when I round. So negative 0.419 is your final answer for number 3. So we're going to erase that. Let's go ahead and let's take a look now at number 4. So for number 4, in order for us to use the quadratic formula, we're going to have to get that 3x over to the other side. So to do that, we need to add 3x to both sides. Okay, it's not erasing. That's not nice. Come on. There we go. So we're going to add 3x to both sides. So then we end up with x squared plus 3x plus 7 is equal to 0. So now we're ready to assign our a, our b, and our c values. So a is equal to 1, b is equal to 3, c is equal to 7. So now we want to plug that into the quadratic formula. So to do that, we're going to just use our little formula. X is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root. Give it a second to catch up here, of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all of that over 2 times a. So again, I want you to simplify what's underneath the radical first, typing that exactly into your calculator. And when you do that, you end up with plus or minus the square root of negative 19 divided by 2. Now remember, whenever you have a negative under a radical, that can't happen. So that means that for number 4, we have no solution. So our final answer for number 4 is no solution. Okay? Let's take a look at some word problems. So when you're doing word problems, when we talk about something hitting the ground, that means that our height is going to be equal to 0. So all that means is we're going to take the equation they give us, set it equal to 0, and then use the quadratic formula. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So for this one, the Power Tower ride at Valley Fair takes riders up to the top of a tower and drops them 60 feet at speeds reaching 80 feet per second. So it gives us a quadratic that models that situation. So its height is in feet, that's h, and t is in seconds. How many seconds after the ground does it take to drop from 60 to 0 feet? So that means for h, we're going to plug in 0. So we have 0 is equal to negative 16t squared plus 80t plus 60. Okay, now it's set up like a quadratic formula we would normally use. Our numbers are just slightly bigger. So our a is equal to negative 16, our b is equal to 80, and our c is equal to 60. So now I'm going to plug that into the quadratic formula. Okay, so when I plug that in, I end up getting t, since we're using t in this one, is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, I'm going to go a little onto the picture there, divided by 2 times a. And this should be 60. Make sure that's clear. So now again, I want you guys to simplify just underneath the radical first. So just that thing underneath the radical first. So then you get negative 80 plus or minus the square root of 80 squared minus 4 times negative 16 times 60. And when you do that, you get 10240. And then 2 times negative 16 is a negative 32. So now we're ready to create our two versions. So let's take a look at our positive version. So we're going to do negative 80 plus the square root of 10240 divided by, again, you're going to hit enter once you've typed that in, then divided by a negative 32. And when you do that, you get negative 0.66 seconds. Again, watch your rounding. Well, negative time doesn't make sense, so I need to throw that answer out. Let's hope my next answer has something more for me. So I'm going to do negative 80 minus the square root of 10240. Hit enter, and then divided by negative 32. And when I do that, I end up with 5.66. So that makes a lot more sense. We don't want negative time. Only positive time makes sense. So I'm going to label this seconds. So I get 5.66 seconds. Okay? All right. Next, let's go ahead and take a look at this one. So we're talking about a stunt person dropping from a height of 210 feet. They give us a quadratic that models their motion. H is the height in feet, T is the time in seconds. How many seconds does it take to get to 30 feet? Well, here's the thing though, our H is going to be 30. So we're going to plug in 30 for our H. So we get 30 is equal to negative 16t squared plus 210. Again, for us to use the quadratic formula, we have to have it solved for 0. So I'm going to subtract 30 from both sides. So then I get 0 is equal to negative 16t squared plus 210 minus 30, which is 180. I knew to plug in 30 for H because we wanted to figure out at what point did the person reach 30 feet. So I plugged in 30 for feet, and then I solved to get 0. So now I'm ready to use the quadratic formula. My A is negative 16, my B is 0, and my C is 180. Okay, so now I'm going to at least get the quadratic formula set up for you. So we're going to do T. So T is equal to the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 A, C, all of that over 2 times A. So again, you want to simplify underneath this radical first. So this 0 is really going to cancel out. All we're going to be left with is just the radical. So we're going to have plus or minus the square root of 11520 divided by negative 32. So then here are the two answers you need to do. We're going to do the positive square root of 1520, take that square root, and then divide it by negative 32. Well, that's going to give us negative 3.35. No negative time. We don't want that. So now we're going to try negative square root of 1520. Again, hit enter, and then divide by negative 32. Well, that gives us positive 3.35 seconds. Yay, positive time. Now all we have to do is label it. So our answer then is we're going to be at 30 feet at 3.35 seconds. So that concludes your note video today. Go ahead and show me your completed note sheet when you're done. Thanks for listening.